now we're going to go to the report of the planning director.
So we do not have anything to report tonight.
Thank you. And now we have an open forum where commissioners may discuss planning, zoning, and general land use items that are not listed on the agenda. There is no public discussion associated with this item. Does anybody have anything they would like to raise? That's great. All right. Then we'll move on to the consent agenda, which includes the planned development Sunrise Metro and Atkinson Stack at approximately 580 South, 500 West, and approval of the meeting minutes. Okay. So I will open a public meeting for the planned development Sunrise Metro and Atkinson Stack. Is there anyone who would wish to speak on that project? If not, I will close the public hearing. So now I'm going to ask for a motion on the consent agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
I have a motion from Commissioner Christensen, a second from Commissioner Scott. So we will do a roll call vote. Commissioner Berry.
No on the plan development, and yes on the meeting minutes.
Commissioner Christensen.
Yes.
Commissioner Scott.
Yes.
Commissioner Leverett.
Yes.
And I will also vote yes. So we have a unanimous consent on the minutes and one no on the planned development. So we'll move on to our public hearing items, our other public hearing items. The first is a zoning text amendment for changes to the adaptive reuse / building preservation incentives related to administrative design review, and the planner is Amy Thompson.
Find slideshow when I'm in front of everyone. There we go. Okay, so this is a text amendment for changes to the building preservation incentives. It's a petition that was initiated by Mayor Erin Mendenhall to make changes to Chapter 21A52 of the zoning ordinance. Staff is recommending that the Planning Commission forward a recommendation of approval to the City Council. So just some quick background to help refresh the commissioners' memories, as well as introduce this ordinance to some of our newer commissioners. In July 2024, the City Council adopted an ordinance establishing the building preservation incentives. These incentives offer optional benefits for development projects that incorporate preservation of eligible buildings. There are two tracks to these incentives. The first one is the adaptive reuse incentives. They are primarily a use incentive to allow for land uses that would not normally be allowed in the zoning district that these buildings are in. Typically, these eligible buildings are historic or culturally significant, and they contribute to the existing neighborhood fabric through their architectural features, size, or former use. Examples of these types of buildings are local landmark sites, National Register properties, and buildings originally constructed as churches, schools, or hospitals. And the second tract is for building preservation. These incentives are designed to support developments that include utilizing an existing building that is 50 years or older by allowing flexibility with certain zoning regulations and a streamlined planning process. These types of incentives may be applied to the existing building, and they also transfer to new construction on the same development site, which may include multiple parcels. Incentives that are offered include waived lot area, creation of lots without frontage, reduced parking, and again, a streamlined process. So since adoption of the ordinance, the Planning Division has received a number of applications for these incentives, as well as several inquiries from potential applicants interested in using the incentives. These are just some examples of the projects that we've issued preliminary approval on. However, over the past year of applying the ordinance, we have identified some parts of the ordinance that need clarification or adjustment in order to operate as originally intended, and that is the purpose of this text amendment, to make those improvements. So these are the proposed changes. We are updating one of the design standards. This is the design standard that relates to new construction if it's associated with an eligible building, and it's for garage doors that are prohibited facing the street. While this standard works for certain developments, it is a barrier for other developments like multifamily, mixed use, and commercial that may incorporate structured parking and have limited access to parking from the side or rear of the property. So we are proposing to make that provision specifically apply to townhome, single-family attached developments. Second is modifications to maximum yards. Currently, the zoning ordinance allows for modifications to minimum yards through an administrative plan development. We are just proposing to extend that to maximum yard areas for those zoning districts that have a maximum setback requirement. And then making a fix to the restrictive covenant requirements. This changes to clarify that projects using the incentives for new development must guarantee retention of the eligible building that qualified them for the incentives for 30 years. Currently, this provision only applies to projects that utilize the incentives for a new building. This clarifies that new development, such as an addition to the existing eligible building, also falls under this requirement, even if the incentives aren't applied to a completely new building. And then a time extension request. This aligns this type of planning process with all of our other planning processes that do allow for a one-year time extension request. And then finally, expanding the scope of modifications that can be reviewed through administrative design review. And I'm going to talk about this one in a little bit more detail. So the scope of alterations eligible for administrative design review was inadvertently limited to additional height for the building preservation incentives. The chapter where these incentives are located is also paired with the affordable housing incentives. And while the eligibility criteria for these incentives differ, both were intended to offer comparable benefits. So the affordable housing incentives allow for modifications to all design standards through administrative design review, whereas the building preservation incentives were limited to height. One thing to note with administrative design review or planning commission design review with height, the standards indicate that you look at all the design standards when you are looking at additional height. And when someone is modifying a design standard, you look at the specific design standard related to that specific request that for the standard that's being modified. So basically, this allows for us to keep the streamlined process with the building preservation incentives. The administrative design review is an important incentive because it streamlines the approval process and allows for approval by the planning director, provided the design standards are met, rather than requiring a public hearing with the planning commission, which can take 3 to 5 months. Administrative design review still has the public process. We still notify community organizations, the 12-day notice, and still collect public comment. It's common for applicants to ask for modifications to design standards when they are requesting additional height. Without this change, projects would need to go through the Planning Commission review process, effectively removing the expedited approval incentive for building preservation projects. Sometimes in zones, specifically like downtown zones, where they don't have any parking requirements, and they don't have density limitations, the streamlined process is really the only carrot that we have to dangle. And again, we're already reviewing additional height, so staff is already looking at all of the standards when we are reviewing additional height requests. In terms of the public process, we followed the requirements for public noticing. That includes notification to all community recognized organizations, as well as a virtual open house. Notice of the public hearing was dropped off at 3 different public libraries, and we have received no public comments on this application. The proposal is consistent with the considerations for text amendments that are outlined in Attachment B of the staff report. The building preservation incentives are reflective of goals, policies, and objectives outlined in adopted plans, and these policies provide direction on existing housing while promoting compatible growth. They also regulate change, incentivize preservation, achieve sustainability benefits. And the proposed ordinance furthers these policies by making improvements to support the use of incentive, the associated process. Again, staff is recommending that the commission forward a recommendation of approval to the City Council. And that is all I have put together for the presentation.
Thank you. Does the Planning Commission have any questions for staff? I do have one question, which is what is the process, what is the public process for the administrative design review?
For administrative design review, we send out notices to the recognized organizations. It's a 12-day notice, and we also send out notices to abutting property owners and property owners across the street, indicating what the proposal is, where they can find out more information about it, and if and what the standards of approval are. And we also indicate a date that the project could be approved if it meets the standards.
So is there a way that people can give public feedback?
Yeah, they can submit public comments. We have one in process that has not been approved, but has gone through the noticing that's making some tweaks, and we have accepted public comment on that and have reviewed it in terms of the standards.
Are the public
and taken those
comments
into
public?
consideration. Yes.
Are they
they're added.
online?
Yes, we add them to the record. They are in Acela.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask for,
Well, I have a follow-up question to that.
sorry?
I have a follow-up question
Sure, go
to
ahead.
one of Amy's answers. So why are we doing 12-day notice? Because I think community councils meet once a month. And how do you see them effectively participating with a 12-day notice?
So the 12-day notice is already in ordinance. That is what we do for all of our administrative processes. That's not something that's being proposed with this.
Yeah.
It's just expanding the scope of the modification of design standards. We're
So
not
that's
changing.
a different noticing timeline than for like ones that come to the Planning Commission?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't particularly think that's inducive to community councils effectively participating, just as a side note.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, well, we'll take public comment. Is there anybody from a recognized community organization who wishes to speak? And I have a card from Cindy Cromer. You'll have 3 minutes.
3 minutes?
2 minutes,
I was
sorry.
going to say, am I at the county?
Okay, all right, just take whatever you want. Go.
So, my name is Cindy Cromer, and I have been looking at the extensions that both the commission and your commission and the Landmarks Commission have been granting as the market for housing has stalled. And I'm especially concerned about the impact that those extensions are having on the East Downtown in terms of sites that are being held but not actively developed or managed. I have no problem with adaptive reuse projects being granted extensions administratively. They are very challenging projects to pull off. They are sustainable projects in terms of materials. They are conserving the built environment. I think they ought to go to the front of the line, frankly. And I want to highlight the difference between someone who's doing a project with an existing building under adaptive reuse and a demolition new construction project. The person working in adaptive reuse is trying to keep the building, and very often the interior finishes in the building. And that means that the security on the site is greater. They don't want people trespassing, and they're very likely to fence the project. They're very likely, after they get their permits issued, to maintain the vigilance about people gaining access, because their goal is to retain the building. And that makes a lot of difference in terms of what the neighborhood experiences. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on this issue? There are no emails. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for review and decision.
I'm going to go ahead and make a motion. This is for PLN PCM 2025-00039. Based on the information presented and discussion, I move that the commission recommends that the city council adopt this request.
Second?
I have a motion from Commissioner Christensen and a second from Commissioner Scott. So I will take a roll call vote here. Commissioner Christensen,
Yes.
Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Leverett,
Yes.
Commissioner Berry,
Yes.
and I will also vote yes. That is a what do you call that? Unanimous. Thank you. This is why I don't do this all the time. I can't remember my words. Okay, and our next agenda item is a zoning text amendment for public hearing requirements for appeals and variances.
All right, so this is a change that's being necessitated by some recently adopted legislation by the Utah legislature, House Bill 368, which was passed and signed by the governor, basically prohibits cities from requiring a public hearing for a request for a variance or land use appeal. This becomes effective May 7th, so regardless of what happens with this text amendment, that's what we'll start following on May 7th. But we are required to bring our code into compliance with state law, so that's what this proposal is doing. Real quick for those, the term variance gets used in a variety of different ways, oftentimes incorrectly from a legal standpoint, and so I just wanted to quickly recap what the commission what a variance actually is. This is not a modification to a design approved in a plan development. This is a specific type of application that's intended to provide and ensure property rights are provided when there is some unique circumstance with a property that makes it impractical or impossible to apply a land use regulation. Both under state code and in city ordinance, there's 5 standards that have to be met. They're all listed here. I'm not going to read them all, but if one of these is not satisfied, then the variance by law has to be denied. One of the key things here is that this concept of unreasonable hardship, which is something that cannot be created by the property owner, and it can't be economic in nature. So just because it may cost a lot doesn't mean that you get a variance. With this proposal, what we're changing is, again, this applies to variances and appeals. Appeals of commission decisions already do not have a public hearing under our code. So this only is appeals of staff level decisions. Instead of a public hearing, we still will have a public meeting. The difference is a public hearing, the people who attend can provide input during the meeting, just like you're familiar with public hearings, whereas a public meeting is more like our briefings, right? So information's provided to an appeal, to our hearing officer, and under our current practice, they take that into consideration as part of the record. Under this new proposal, we'll still be having the public meeting. The public will not be allowed to speak because state law prohibits it. But we are creating a noticing period, just like what you discussed with the administrative design review stuff, where there will be a notice to neighbors. Partly that is to have a period of discovery so that the record can be complete, which is one of the benefits of a public hearing on these types of issues, particularly variances. So sometimes somebody will bring some information forward that is not known, that is somehow related, like maybe they have an easement or something like that, that just isn't showing up on our known records. So that provides an opportunity for people to submit evidence. It clarifies in our code that no new information, et cetera, can be submitted for commission decisions. That's because your decision can only be based on the information provided to you at that time. So someone can't come in after the fact and try to supplement. And then we also wanted to clarify that the hearing officer can remand a decision back to the decision on appeals. So if they feel like the commission didn't make a finding that was backed up by either evidence or testimony or discussion, they can say, hey, go back, rethink this, find some evidence that I can use to uphold your decision or make a decision. So the key points, we already went over some of this. Unlike the legal notice requirement for a public meeting, which is only 24 hours, we're going to have a 12-day notice period. Evidence can be submitted in writing up to the day before so that we can prepare it for the appeals hearing officer. And evidence is only for variances, and then commission appeals are on the record. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Do commissioners have any questions? Okay, I'm going to open the public hearing. Is there anyone who wishes to speak on this item? Okay then, seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for action or a motion.
I'm going to make a motion again. This is for PLN PCM 2025-00327. Based on the information presented and discussion, I move that the commission recommends that the city council adopt this request.
Second.
I have a motion from Commissioner Christensen and a second from Commissioner Scott. So we'll start with Commissioner Leverett.
Yes.
Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Christensen,
Yes.
Commissioner Berry,
Yes.
and the chair will also vote yes. So that passes unanimously. And now we're going to have a present. So I'm going to close the agenda items that have public hearings, and we are going to have our other business, which is a briefing on Growing Water Smart.
All right, thank you. So Growing Water Smart is an effort that's also a requirement under state code for Salt Lake City and other cities to add what's called a water element to our general plan. And so we've gone through a process of really learning over the last probably close to 2 years now about what that means and how to do it, and that's called Growing Water Smart. And so what we're going to do today is go over what the state code requires and some of our initial data analysis and findings. We do have Holly Lopez from Public Utilities here to help answer questions and provide any other insight that she feels appropriate. So like I said, this is a requirement to link land use planning and water planning. The good news is we are already doing both of these things, right, as a city. And we have a pretty extensive water master plan. And as you know, we have a bunch of land use plans. And so really what we're focused on is how do we merge those types of things together to satisfy state law, but also make it easier and for us to do our long-range planning, and also provide decision makers with an understanding of what the impacts, particularly of future growth, are on our water supply. So we have to have this adopted by the end of this year. We're going to go over some of the key components in state law. So I already talked about this a little bit, but ultimately this is about understanding the effect that development has on water demand and our water infrastructure, so our ability to deliver water. And so we need to take into account existing development and future development and changes to city operations that can help reduce and eliminate wasteful water activities. So what specifically is required? We need to address those key components I just identified. And we also need to, the Planning Commission is tasked with this, and our job as staff is to prepare this for you, but identify water policies that the city can implement. This is something we've already done, but specify landscaping options for both current and future developments. We're already ahead of that. Most cities actually have done that because it was a requirement to qualify for various incentives for property owners to switch out turf. And then specifically, again, specify the low water use landscaping standards. So we do have mandatory outreach. So obviously we are coordinating with public utilities. One thing that you may not know is that public utilities is the water provider for most of the eastern portion of the valley. And so their service area is much larger than just the city. So they get the fun job of doing this with other cities too. And so we're trying to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction with how we do that. We also need to work with both the state Division of Water Resources and the Department of Agriculture and Food, and then any local irrigation and canal companies have to at least be notified as well. The state recommended considerations are to include regional water conservation goals. So this is for the watershed that we're located in, and most of these regional water conservation goals, at least for our watershed, address things like how much water is going to the Great Salt Lake and what the overall target is for reducing water consumption. We, like I said, will consider the city's water conservation plans, which I believe is also in the process of being updated, and then sustainable landscaping provisions. One thing that we haven't done that is something that the state asked cities to consider is the regulation of evaporative sources, so ponds, pools, things like that. And so that's an area where we're looking into what that might look like. So cities can also consider a bunch of other things. We could apply water budgets for certain type of developments. In some way, we've already done this because we have a cap of the daily water use for all land uses in the city. We can require new developments to ensure that they either bring water or have it available before they can be approved. The state also suggests modifying lot sizes, configurations, again, landscaping standards, which is a big target. Use incentives to reduce water use, discourage economic development incentives for large water users. Some of you may know that we had a very large, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, water user that was incentivized by the state to locate in Salt Lake City, which prompted our capping of daily water use. And then require adequate water supplies and facilities for new development. Some of that we already do with new development, has to upsize various utilities if there's not capacity. And so that happens with quite a few developments actually. What our plans already do. So this is just some summary pages from our water conservation plan of each chapter. So this is where we start to really get into understanding how much water is used. I'm not going to read everything on here, but luckily this presentation is posted and this document is shareable and also available on the Public Utilities website. But the takeaway here are the recommendations, the risks and recommendations. So clearly our water supply has certain vulnerabilities. We're in a very high seismic area. Whenever we have wildfires, That's reducing how much water we have available. And then the big unknown is climate change. What happens if we suddenly have prolonged droughts, things like that. And so that's where these recommendations that are listed here come from. The other chapters go through different things. So chapter 2 really is about historic use and current use. One of the big takeaways is you can see that our per capita water use is going down. That's good, right? That's our goal. And sometimes going down pretty dramatically. This breaks it down by the 4 land use categories that water planners use: residential, commercial, institution, and industrial, and both indoor and outdoor use. So you can see how there's some differentiation there, whereas residential uses don't necessarily use as much as commercial uses indoor, but they make up most of the outdoor water use. And then some uses like industrial use very little outdoor water use. If you ever go to an industrial site, you'll see why. And then chapter 3 goes over some more water overall targets, where we are. So you can see that 2020, when this was done, that target was 206 gallons per day capita. The goal 2025, where we should be in 2030, and I think the long-term goal is 2060 in this plan. And all of these align with the watershed and regional goals as well. Holly, feel free if I'm getting any of this wrong or missed something. So, chapter 4 talks about various practices that the city can use. And a lot of these things I think we're already doing, as you can see on here. We also audited our land use plans. And so we took all of the things that are required by state code and put them in a chart and went through every single one of our community plans as well as the zoning ordinance to just see how we're doing. Obviously, if we were already doing these things in our plans, we were good, right? But what we've discovered, and you can see on this table, that these are the things that the code requires us to do. Some of our plans are better than others. Those tend to be new ones where water and resource use was a big focus, like the Northwest Quadrant. And you can see that our zoning code has done most of these because we've been really proactive about putting them in regulations, because that's an immediate impact versus putting them in plans and then going through the regulations. So this is a continuation, and this is one area where our plans are really not doing a good job, is identifying these strategies that we can use to help reduce water. So this is going to be one of our focus areas as we update our general plan. And then we've also been using a best practices for water efficiency and land use planning. And this is local to the Interior West, so the Intermountain area. And on this, you can see that we've done a lot of these things. A lot of these are in zoning code, but a lot of our plans actually do talk about these best practices. And so that's good. And we're going, as we go through this, these are going to be things that we integrate into our plans as well. So our overall approach, I already mentioned that the public utility service area extends beyond our city boundaries, and they get to do this for a good chunk of the eastern portion of Salt Lake County, particularly in the valley. But we've also identified some pretty significant issues with how we plan in the city. One is that we have 9 community plans, each of them with their own future land use map. They do not coordinate with each other. And so, for example, I think we have more than 60 future land use designations when you add them all up. And some of them, low density in one plan, maybe up to 5 dwelling units per acre, where low density in another is 12. And so that makes it really hard for us to project, if we were to build out according to our future land use plans, how much water we're actually going to need. And so part of this is going to be recommending consolidating those future land use designations so they mean the same thing across the city. Because it is a citywide issue, it's more important for us to have consistency so we can actually do this type of planning. And so that's one of the outputs that's going to come from this. We're going to do this by adding a water element to Plan Salt Lake. So Plan Salt Lake is our big vision plan for the city. There's, I think, 15 different focus areas. Water is going to be an additional one. And so that's where we'll add these initiatives. We're going to use, obviously, comply with state code requirements. We're going to look at our existing policies that we know work. And then we're going to add additional policies that are going to be data-based. So how are we using our water? What does that mean? And we're going to get into some examples of that as we go through here. So within our plans, we already have things like some watershed protection, water quality, water conservation, and then we have the big supply and demand study. Our zoning code, we already touched on this, but it does a lot of things already. Where we're looking at data is trying to better understand how different types of development in those 4 categories use water, and what are some of those key development characteristics of those. Can we flesh something out, and is there a relationship between lot size, lot width, density, lot size, or development size, all of these things, and is there a way that we can figure out some commonalities of regulations that are actually promoting an increase in water use? And so we're going to start by going over some of the single-family zones. So this is all the R1 zones. This is a sample of, I think, 200 properties randomly selected based on different age, zoning district, size, et cetera. And so this is all of those added together on this chart. But generally what it shows is, and one of the things that we've known is that when we are in a drought, more people are aware and focused on conserving water. When we've had wet years, people tend to slide on that focus. And that's what this chart shows. When we look into more specific types of things, so on this left chart, each one of these represents the 3 R1 zoning districts, with the one on the line graph, the trend line, on the left-hand side being the R1 5000, R1 7000 in the middle, and then R1 12,000, and by year. So one of the things that this clearly demonstrates, larger lots use more water. I think we instinctively know that, but it's not simply just because it's a large lot. Some of it is that they may have more outdoor water use. This chart on the right is a trend line. Each dot represents one of the properties we looked at and their size. And so what this demonstrates is that, yes, there is a relationship between lot size and water use. And then the variation from that trend line is how positive that relationship is. So this is a statistical analysis of that. When there's a lot of dots further away and there's no real pattern of how those dots are, it says, yes, there's a positive relationship between lot size, but there's other variables that impact how much water use. And those are what's listed here. Our larger lots tend to have larger household sizes. So an R1 12,000 property tends to have more people per house. So that means there's more water use. They tend to have more appliances, things like that. The trend line for developments that have between 2 and 10 dwelling units kind of follows the same kind of pattern that we see in the drought years. There is a decline in water consumption. When it's wet, it increases. This chart is a little different in that last dot is the 5-year average, so we can see where we are. Here's some more analysis about looking at what happens as density increases. So the larger the developments that have more units obviously tend to use more water, right? They've got more people there. We looked at lot width. Again, this is actually a pretty strong relationship. The wider the lot, the more water is going to be used. That's tend to be because the development's either larger or has a lot more outdoor water use. We also looked at impervious area. So this is still a positive relationship, but not as strong, that shows properties that have a higher amount of square footage that's impervious do tend to use more water, although that relationship is probably the weakest out of most of them. This is where we get some really interesting numbers. So these are 4 different charts that are all looking at the same thing, but with projects and developments that have different numbers of dwellings in it. So you can see the top left, these are 10 to 25 units per building. Again, it followed that same trend line, huge spike in 2024. Don't know why.
What's the
So-
sample size? What's the sample size on these?
I think this one, we tried to get 50 projects in each category.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so enough to make it somewhat significant and give us a good idea. When you look at the 25 to 50 dwelling units, this had the lowest consumption in 2024. We also try to keep the numbers of sample size in each category the same so that we were comparing appropriate numbers. This category also didn't see the spike that the others did. So that's a really interesting relationship that we're probably going to try to dig into further. The 50 to 100 dwelling units also had a big peak between 2021 and 24 and bucked the trend of decreasing during drought years. It went up. Again, kind of unknown. And then projects that had more than 100 dwelling units, which is harder because we have some that could be 400 units and some that may be 105. So this is a little bit less relevant, I think, but you can see it's pretty steady, a big, huge spike in 2021 to 2022, and then leveling off. But I think another important piece of this is the left hand, the rows, are the consumption in thousands of gallons. So you can see based on the sample size that some of these development categories use significantly less water. For example, the 25 to 50 developments tended to use less water overall than the 10 to 25, which was really interesting. We also looked at mixed-use projects that are primarily residential. Again, increased with during droughts. This is probably because more and more people were working from home and spending more time at home, which we think is probably characteristic of the others as well, that bucked that trend. And then it leveled off, and then a huge decline in 2024. And that's probably related to people going back to the workplace and no longer working from home. So that's just to give you an idea of the data that we're looking at so we can better plan our future water use. So where we are right now, we're finishing this data analysis. We're a little bit behind because of other pressing issues that have come up, but we're going to complete that. We're going to send our draft out to all of our departments for input because one of the key components is how city operations can reduce their water. And so we want them to look at that. We will, in between all of these processes, before we get to the adoption process, we will have additional updates for the commission where we'll get into some of that data, some of the input we're receiving from other departments, so you're aware of it. And then May and June, we're going to do most of our public engagement, and then the adoption process will probably be July through December with Planning Commission recommendation, then City Council. That's all I have. Happy to answer questions. Well, there's only 5 of you up there, so I've been looking at all of you.
I have only been waiting 4.5 years for this, so I'm so glad it finally happened. I just have a few thoughts. One of them is when we talk about the differences between residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional, do we have data that's breaking down residential. And so if we go back to public comments, right? We hear a lot about the water. We don't have enough water for this, and that's not our purview. We're not public utilities, yada yada. So one of the questions I have is, do we have better breakdowns within that residential category? You did some analysis, because I think it may be smart to consider, as we move this forward, some way for departmental reviews, when public utilities reviews the projects, that they don't always do this because there's no standardized review for any of those other departments, but that we consider something where public utilities is grading it of like, what, I'm just making this type stuff up, but giving some sort of evaluation that this project, we have water to meet this demand in a way that we can communicate in the staff report, to show that we are looking at this, to show it's being considered and it's part of the review.
Yeah.
Because we're just going to hear more and more of that, and we're not the experts. But if we start making it part of, maybe not the evaluation for planning, but the evaluation for public utilities, and that it gets wrapped up into the report, that would be really helpful as we move forward in communicating to our residents that these are things we're obviously considering. And I think the residential breakdown may also be beneficial to show, because that conference I went to, the APA conference I went to that sparked my question 4.5 years ago, was, I can't remember who it was or anything like that, but this notion that certain larger developments, high density developments, overwhelmingly use less water than single families at a certain point. And it would be nice to be able to also state, all right, a 25 to 50 development unit is using water that's equivalent to 10 single family homes, right? To better articulate and understand and communicate how density overall is probably using less water than this. So having that comparison, I think, will also be helpful for all of those reasons. And I don't know how you would necessarily fold that into future reporting or future considerations, but I think you're at the point in doing this where that it warrants that type of thinking as well.
Yeah, and so this whole Growing Water Smart program that we have has multiple steps in it. One of those longer term steps is to be able to do exactly that, so that when a project comes in, we know, based on similar sized projects that have come through already that we have water use data on, that we can look at that and say, it's anticipated that this project will use this much water. And then we can start building that up to make sure that we're tracking with our overall supply, so that we're looking at all of those 4 categories of land uses and what's happening with that as we grow and change. So the answer is yes, it's not going to be part of this, what we do in the general plan update, because it's more focused on the longer term, how we analyze projects and development and policies to make sure that they're working and that we're trending in the right way, so that we can ensure that we do have the water supply as we grow.
Okay, I do think that's important.
Yeah.
And it's important to figure out ways to incorporate that into the staff reports. So that, because some of the new standards do reference capacity, right? Mm-hmm. And I made the argument when we did that we aren't the ones to best interpret capacity for anything, whether it's like, sewer or water or whatever. But that is one of the standards, and figuring out how we incorporate that into the reporting, I think, will be a very important step as we continue to grow, not only to communicate to the public, but also then to set to give the planning commissioners better knowledge of
Yes.
how it is being evaluated to our capacity. Not only our capacity to, do we have enough water to do this development, but does the infrastructure have the capacity for it? Because sometimes public utilities comments will reference, we're going to have to upgrade the capacity, but it's not consistent, their comments. So the consistency may have to come within the planning office.
Yeah, well, the good thing is that planning and public utilities are definitely 100% on the same page with where we want to go,
Yeah.
and our elected officials are too. And so that is all part of what we want to do. We want to be able to provide the data to make better decisions.
I want to bring this up because I don't have another 4.5 years to like get to this next part when you do it, so you'll hear it now. But I'm glad that we started more of this conversation, because I know the city is doing a lot already, but I think we have a lot of things that overlap with planning, and how the frustration sometimes as a planning commissioner of like, I don't know how to evaluate this. I don't have enough information. And so it's just like, well, okay, I guess it's fine. So I appreciate that. Thanks, Nick.
I have some thoughts that I want to add, and mine tend to be very much based on my own personal experience here, where I've been living in a townhouse for almost 20 years now, and have served on the HOA on and off for about half of that time period. And we have 92 units, the clubhouse, the pool, and the sprinklers for our landscaping all on 1 meter. And in hindsight, I think that it's not the best idea to allow things to be built that aren't individually metered, especially now because we've seen a sharp increase in the water utilization and suspect that there's a leak somewhere in the system and we can't track it down. So one of my thoughts is, because I don't know a whole lot about the building codes that would or wouldn't require meters to be put in, but I'm curious whether there's any research on best practices into whether more multifamily development should be individually metered.
Yeah, we're happy to make note of that and bring that back with more information for sure.
Cool. And one other comment along the same line is that we have also been wanting to look into water-wise landscaping or xeriscaping. And the problem that we've encountered is that most of the incentive programs all focus around single-family homes and not around multifamily. So that's something that, I don't know, maybe the Salt Lake City Green could be sent that message to. So
We're also happy to share that with our partners that manage those, so that we have a really good chain of
Perfect.
communication with them.
And I'm really happy to see this being brought up, and think it's the right thing to align land use planning and water planning.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? So it's always tricky to estimate capacity for any sort of system that we have, like transportation capacity or parking capacity or, utility capacity, water capacity. So if we start doing this for water, we can probably think about doing it otherwise. But when we have individual projects, we still don't evaluate them normally based on the capacity, unless it's a critical capacity, like we have no water availability in that particular lot. I mean, we don't say, and so unless we actually put in place some policies where, the planners of the Planning Commission could say, you cannot build a 500-unit project in this community because we don't have the capacity for water, 20 years from now. I mean, those kind of policies that affect individual units or individual projects are pretty difficult to put in place.
Yeah, for sure. The state has kind of opened the door for that by
Yep.
saying development may have to bring their own water or not build to that. So
Right.
those are all things that I think we'll have to evaluate continually. That's not going to be just come up with it now and see. And I would imagine that we will get to a point where we get so critically close to this may be decades down the road, but where we get so critically close to our available supply that we'll have to make some much more drastic policies as a city.
Yeah, I mean, I think about a lot of our public response here has to do with traffic. And, this project will add traffic to our roads. And we don't have any way of actually evaluating a project based on the traffic that it will generate, and whether or not that would be over capacity in a particular road. So it's a similar kind of problem, where if we can't even evaluate that as part of the criteria for a project, it's not even something we can say. So, and it's also difficult to say that this particular project will, in fact, take you from E service to A service, or A service or E to E or something, level traffic patterns. So both of these things are difficult to put into a planning that affects individual projects. Okay. Anybody else have any comments, questions? Alrighty. Having finished with our business, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you.